Welcome everybody to GoLocal Live's Where is America Going? Discussion about where the United States is, where it's been, and where we're moving on to. I want to thank everybody for tuning in on GoLocal Live and on social media, and welcome our audience for joining us tonight. We are here at the beautiful pavilion at Grace Church, an amazing new addition to downtown Providence, glass and copper, an amazing building. We want to thank them for hosting us tonight. We've got an amazing group of people who are going to help guide us through a discussion. I'll introduce first to my immediate left, Bob Whitcomb, a longtime newspaperman, I'll emphasize that. International Herald, Herald Tribune, Wall Street Journal, editorial page editor at the Providence Journal for about 20 years, and now GoLocal columnist. It's the best Sunday read going, is his column on Sundays. Next to him is Jim Murphy. Jim Murphy's a Rhode Islander from Warren and ran both of Link Almond's campaign and really has been a top-level Republican consultant over the past 20 years. He was political director to now President Donald Trump during the campaign this summer of 2016. Next to him is Kate Nagel, GoLocal's news editor. Former Hill staffer and PR consultant over the years, joined GoLocal about 5 years ago, and are also our good friend Mike Sheehan, former head of Hill Holiday ad agency, one of the largest ad agencies in the United States, and then led the Boston Globe for 3 years, ending his tenure at the beginning of 2017, I believe.
January 1st, 2016, midnight.
Midnight.
12:01-ish.
12:01-ish.
But who's counting?
3 years.
3 years,
Yeah.
exactly.
The purpose of tonight is really to take a look at, obviously, America's in a divisive nature since the 2016 election, and we wanted to take a look at where it is historically. There have been other periods of times like this, where we're going during these midterm elections and into the future. So I'm going to start off. Bob Whitcomb, how did we get here?
We got here in our current sort of swamp because of accelerating technological change. I think it had a lot to do with it. Most of you have thought about these things too. Globalization, but I think especially accelerating technological change, which has changed the way we work, the way we live. And I think people are still trying to deal with this. I think people are anxious, hopeful about how some of these changes may work out, but I think there's more anxiety than hope at the moment. I think there's a sense that our society, culture is moving too fast. The changes are too much to integrate. And they're coming at a time when the demographics are challenging, the aging of the population. We haven't figured out how we're going to pay for such a large cohort of decrepit people like me, for example. How we're gonna pay for that. And I think another quick reaction I have to that question is that I think we're in a lot of denial. We're so stressed out by this that there's tremendous myopia about how to, pay for what needs to be paid for, taxes and so on and so forth. So I think there's sort of an element of paralysis about deciding or not deciding what we should do next.
Jim Murphy, you were the architect, one of the architects of one of the greatest upsets in American political history. If we go to the New York Times odds making going into the last week, it was about 9-1 that Hillary Clinton would win this thing. How'd we get here?
So I agree with what Bob said. I guess I would add the following. There's a book, The End of Big. And so I think related to technology, a symptom of that is that institutions that once held public respect and had some sort of, that people looked up to and took guidance from, are gone. Whether it's the church or government or business.
Trust.
There's no trust. The only thing now, if you...
I think I'd add trust into what I said. I think the speed of change is undermining trust, and this is, I think, devastating to a democracy.
I think that, whereas in politics, I think sort of political parties, I think, state chairmen and sort of the infrastructure that used to have an influence on who elected candidates or who were nominated the old backfilled rooms and conventions, that's gone. And today, if you do surveys, I think one of the only institutions that still has pretty widespread public support is the military. But with that exception, I think it's gone. And so in that environment and the technological change, I think both parties have seen a rise in influence of the more active wings of the party. And it's very much the same on the Democrat side as it is on the Republican side. So I think a combination of technology, the diminishment of the influence of institutions has allowed louder, more strident, more left of center or right of center partisanship to drown out the center. When I was saying earlier, I've been around a while, and in the Senate you had Bob Dole and Pat Moynihan and Scoop Jackson and Paul Tsongas and other, sure they were Democrats or Republicans, but they were thoughtful and they were trying to find common ground and get stuff done. I think what's happened is that those types of leaders have been really eviscerated because of lack of ideological purity on either side, and I think that is what has really brought us to where we are today.
Kate Nagel, in somewhere around October or September,
August 2015.
August of 2015, more than a year before the election, you wrote a story.
Could Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump win in Rhode Island? It was a slow news day, one of those summer months that we said, God, what are we going to do for a big story? The whole delegation was in Central Falls. I said, let me go out and talk with them about the Democratic side. Very much said, oh, he's a nice guy. He's a nice guy. But, Hillary shares most of his ideals and kind of poo-pooed Bernie. Talked with some of the really early adopters here for Donald Trump, and people said, oh, they're nuts too. And then, I republished the article after the, after the primaries. But to Jim's point, I think, the seeds to sort of the rifts, not just between the parties, but within the parties themselves. When I was on the Hill from 01 to 05 were certainly already there. The Mod Squad had completely diminished. It was already divisive back then. And I think to both of Bob and Jim's points that social media has played a huge role in being able to amplify those divisions within the parties themselves. And I think it's also empowered people that felt maybe the traditional infrastructure in either side of the party, hence seeing a Trump emerge or seeing a Bernie emerge from having that ability to be able to tap into those folks who thought that they weren't being recognized within the parties themselves. So now the Republican and Democratic Party, as we knew it 10 years ago, is, they're completely turned on their heads. So, but instead of coming to the middle, there's still no middle. It still keeps digging in deeper into deeper divides, and where we are is a huge question mark.
Mike Sheehan, you know messaging. You've branded lots of messages for lots of, and then you end up at the Boston Globe, a leading newspaper in the United States, during this huge turmoil. How did you guys handle it?
I had to call in grief counselors today after Election Day. It's not true.
Was that for the liberal media? There?
No, no, it's not at all. No, it's not. No, it's, I think my perception of, I think we're a nation that loves to be whipsawed, right? We go from, 8 years of Clinton to 8 years of Bush to 8 years of Obama to now 4 years of, well, maybe 4 years of Trump. That we love to go back and forth, but it always seems to balance out in some odd way. But it is a period of being of extremes, of going back and forth. And I think in the media is trying to figure out desperately what role they play, because true journalistic enterprises that apply journalistic standards to what they do, it takes time and money to do that stuff, and by the time they publish a story, it's already been out there in 5 different outlets, and it's really tough to compete. And newspapers being drained of resources, they don't have the feet on the street, they don't have the army of reporters they used to have. So getting to the truth is really, really difficult. And social media in particular, there's just a ton of untruths out there floating around. And so, but I think in the end, again, if I do believe that things tend to balance out over time, I think that, voters and people will become better filters.
Are we seeing, though, this reverberation? The difference between Clintons and Bushes was minuscule.
Right.
Now we're going from Barack Obama to Donald Trump.
Yeah.
This is cataclysmic. This
Right.
is the next swing back to a liberal progressive, or do we stay in a mode of, Jim, you measure these things, you look at these things?
I think Donald Trump, there were macro things at play here as well. I mean,
Talk about some of the macro things.
so
what was the number
look,
one
there were
issue that fueled Donald?
globalization, Brexit, so I think you started with, just people just generally being concerned about things weren't the way they were, the world's, so I think that was sort of an umbrella that sort of set the stage, if you will. I also think that Trump was, I think that the Trump campaign started off anti-Washington with, it's a little off-color, but Haley Barbour, former governor of Mississippi, former head of the RNC, had a great, he's very quotable, much more so than me, but he said, America was looking for the biggest middle finger it could find, and it found it in Donald Trump. And so I think there was it started there. And I think it stayed in politics, right? Where I agree that there was, that part of it was sort of an anti-big government thing, but what I think happened in the Trump campaign was that it transcended politics. And it became a cultural a phenomenon, really, where, how is it that someone who, questionable character, Access Hollywood, said all these things, I wouldn't say was bogged down with the truth, and and who everybody didn't even agree with on everything, yet they were for him. And I think it became this anti-political correctness, and then when the media hit him, it became, what, I don't care, but at least this guy's doing this. And that is why I think, with all due respect to the campaign, I think it was much larger than any campaign. And so you juxtapose that against the perfect opposite of that. He could not have had a better foil in Hillary, and Bill Clinton and George Bush being best friends, and it started with this macro socioeconomic thing that I think goes beyond U.S., and then I think Trump tapped into it, took it to a different level against the perfect foil.
He knew how to do it. I mean, he's reality TV star.
Right, he knew how to be on TV.
This is an image and sound world. People don't read much anymore, and they'd seen this guy. He seemed forceful, a guy with the ability to turn things around. You're fired. I can get things done. And he'd been doing this for a long time. He's a hell of I think he's a crook myself. I know he's a crook, but he's a hell of a salesman. I don't think we can underestimate that. He knows which buttons to push. And I thought he did it superbly. I totally agree with Jim. And if you recall, I was one of those who predicted he could win.
Yeah.
This sort of, what would you call, wonkish, Mrs. Clinton, perfect foil for someone like Trump.
Well, that's my next question for Jim, as you talk about the cult of Trump and who really embraced him for that, as you said, the big middle finger. But when he faced that foil in Hillary, how much did he draw from people when they just saw the two of them, not because they embraced Trump, but they just said, I can't vote for Hillary?
You get a lot of that.
Mucho.
Well, I tell the story. The Monday morning after the Billy Bush video comes out, I'm taking an Uber from our place on the east side down, and the driver's got a Navy sticker on his car, older guy. I get in the car, and it's like he's reading off the Democratic National Committee's bullets. Trump's this, Trump's that, Trump's this. He stops in front of One Financial Plaza. I get out to go to Starbucks, and he turns to me. First time he turns around, looks at me, and he goes, well, what are you going to do? You can't vote for Hillary.
Right.
Yeah, right.
Okay?
Right,
So,
right,
the buyer.
I also think
I heard that too.
Trump had two opponents. He ran against Hillary Clinton, and he ran against the media.
Yeah.
And they were explicit opponents. And he tapped into a really genuine dislike and distrust for the media. It's real.
Even
And-
though he was
and
in the media.
It was, yeah.
He was a creature of the media.
So he knew how to pull it apart.
Absolutely.
And this is a guy who, you know, he, with all due respect, you know, even I mean, New York City is a big media market. He's used to having microphones shoved in his mouth. He's used to
Fast,
saying
very
controversial
fast.
thing. He was good on his feet, and so he was ready for prime time. And he's the kind of person who didn't shy away from that, but relished it.
And the more he did it, the more breathless the media became.
Oh, right. I mean, they
The more
became
apoplectic they
totally
became.
obsessed with it.
And so he knew, he just kept going, and it was a perfect foil.
And he was always dominating the news.
Yeah.
It was
So
just
we're
every
a year
minute
and a
would
half-
be
Stop, they're
something-
obsessed with it.
We're a
When
year and a
he was
half
in
later.
Warwick, I just got to tell this story. I was in the press corps. He was in Warwick for his press stop. We were like literally corralled in sort of the back of the Crown Plaza. And they keep the press to let the guests go out. And I'm standing next to Ian Donis, and this young kid walks by, 16 or 17. He just looks at both of us, and he goes, "Media sucks." And I look at Ian, and he goes, "You talking to me?" I'm like, "I don't know you. I'm here to do my job."
So here we are a year and a half later. If we take it to Rhode Island, we've got a governor and a good economy, low unemployment, who's trapped at 40% approval. We've got a president who's at 35% approval.
I think it went up a little bit recently.
37, 38, 39, call it under 40. Are we just going to always be at this period of time for the near future in which the electorate does not feel good about those that they have placed in office?
Yeah, I think there's a generalized loss of trust, and as Jim and everybody has mentioned, in institutions, individuals. I think the way the media is structured now, in speaking the media very broadly, I think it tends to engender that mistrust and intensify it. And it's hard to see that getting better anytime soon. We don't believe anything. You mentioned Rhode Island, Governor Raimondo's, presiding over a pretty good economy. How much of that is due to her efforts? How much of that's just regional and national? I don't know. But she's not very popular. But, most leading politicians now are not popular.
I think there's
Just general distrust, anxiety, just kind of sour.
Bob, how different from 1968?
In trust, you mean?
Yeah, yeah.
I think there's
In
less
institutions.
now. I think there's
Okay.
much less now, yeah. Across the board, all major institutions, the press, even religion has taken taken a dive on trust because of the various sex scandals, this kind of thing. But I think trust, so when I started writing about these trust things, way back when I was working for the Boston Herald Traveler, in the Coolidge administration, and we used to do stories about who's trusted. At that time, the Roman Catholic Diocese of Boston was very highly trusted. I think Richard, Cardinal Cushing was running the show, and you had the feeling, despite the tumult of the 60s, which I well remember, that the basic institutions, the major institutions in American life were solid, were okay.
Mike, you've messaged everything. You've built brands, Dunkin' Donuts, things like that. Is it that some of these messengers have not aren't leveraging the power of branding and aren't leveraging how to create a viable message that connects with the consumer?
I think they're trying to figure it out. Even 10 years ago, it was much easier because it was far more linear.
Right.
When you wanted to message, television, print, you hit a plan, boom, 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 and it was linear. Now it's an inch deep and a mile wide, and it's out of your control. So I think that is the really great brands figure it out. A great brand like JetBlue, they figure out how to do it, right? They've got great engagement on social media. They have really bad weekends and days, but they know how to respond. If they're taking a task in Twitter, they respond like this. And so great brands know how to do it, but it takes a long time to figure it out because it's messy, it's complicated, and you just can't buy your way through it like you used to be able to with a big fat media buy. You can't do it.
I think
You have to think.
I think the new, before, in politics, or 1,100 gross rating points a week, you could punch through a message, you'd get the reach and frequency you needed, and that would work. Now, to your word, messier, I think the key going forward, the most effective stuff is peer-to-peer. You look at Yelp. Are you going to believe a restaurant review by a restaurant critic in a newspaper, or are you going to go to Yelp and see if it's 4.6 or 3.8? You're going to believe real people, and so I think social media has provided consumers and voters to access to information that they deem more reliable than anything the candidates
Is that a
say.
good thing? Is it democratization? Is it that everybody gets a fair, it's not just the editorial page gurus over there on Fountain Street dictating what we believe?
But it's also people think Tom Petty died a day before he did. I mean, there's there's the fear factor of where are you getting accurate news, and you know, talk about fake news, and the interesting thing about the term fake news. You know, you see a lot of times in social media, people will slap that on something they just don't agree with when it is in fact actually factual. So, you know, you talk about people trying to be discerning consumers of media. You have people who will blatantly say, I just don't believe the facts that you put in front of me. I'm going to call it fake news. How do you compete with that?
It's very unsettling if you cannot agree on facts. You know, of course, the famous John Adams, facts are hard things, but, Orwell would have had a field day now. So would have H.L. Mencken, for that matter.
Mike?
But people do read. I'm reminded, my mentor, Arthur Finkelstein, used to have a great story, and he said he once did a survey and said, do you use Crest toothpaste because of its advertising? And people said, no. He said, well, why do you use Crest toothpaste? He says, because it produces 42% fewer cavities. and so, people will say they don't, but they read it, and they are influenced by what they read, even though they say they don't believe it. Back in my New Hampshire days, Bill, the union leader, same thing, a candidate, do you believe what the union leader says? No. What do you think about this candidate? And then they would just, everything the union leader had been saying about him for the last month. So I do think, although people say they don't believe what they read, their opinions are influenced by what they read.
So that's subliminal,
yeah,
obviously.
it's there.
And
Here's
there's a
day
hierarchy.
after
There's a
day
hierarchy
after
to
day.
it. I mean,
But
I do think that the really good major metro dailies, Washington Post, New York Times, because people do understand the work that goes into it, that there is a higher level of credibility. They're not perfect, but there's a much higher level of credibility. And they know they're biased, right? They're is the media, of course the media is biased. The media is done by human beings. Human beings are biased. The media is biased, but they understand it, and they understand where it's coming from. So I think there's a higher degree of trust. Is there a degree of trust high enough that people will pay for it so it can survive? That's the question, because it's really expensive to produce.
I agree that and I think that is the challenge for social media outlets, is whether or not they can convince people there's an editorial content. I mean, if you're going to get a story on the front page of the Boston Globe, it's checked out,
Absolutely.
the source it, get a story in a blog,
Yep.
I write it.
Yeah. No.
There's nobody checking it, yet it gets picked up and gets retweeted and gets going around, and so that's the problem.
Can these places be profitable again by selling the idea that this stuff is carefully checked out, it's layered, it may be lawyered in a controversial story, and over time, I believe, this can produce a profitable publication, whether it's online or something else. Well, we're going through this period of churn, and I think this is going to take a long while. This is all very new, remember, all this sort of social media and stuff. Facebook was invented, 2005 or something like that? We're still adjusting to this very, very fragmented presentation of news and information. And I think we have to expect that people are going to be confused, angry, and fragmented about this for quite a long while. I do believe in the long run, since it's in the sort of economic and personal self-interest of the users of this stuff, to use outlets that are reliable, within the human capacity, that the serious places will come back and start making some money.
Let's pivot a little bit. Let's talk about, we've got major elections in Rhode Island, and we've got major midterm elections across the country. What are we going to see? Are we going to see